Talmud tells us that Hillel the elder had 80 students. The greatest of his students, his name was Rabbi Yonasan ben Uziel. And of his lesser students was Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was the prince of Israel when the second temple was destroyed. Hillel was the prince before him, and Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai was of the lesser students of Hillel. Rabbi Yonasan ben Uziel, Rabbi Yonasan was of the greatest. So how do you determine who's the greatest, who's the lesser? So the Talmud says that whatever Rabbi Yonasan ben Uziel knew, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai knew exactly, no less than the greater rabbi. And it goes to, it details and delineates what he knew. He knew the Mishnah, he knew, and it goes, not only that, they understood the speech of birds, the trees. You know, in existence, the communications which are in nature, and those communications convey many secrets of the workings of existence. They were able to read all these subtle aspects of existence to understand all the workings of existence. So the Gemara says, if the lesser student knew as much as the greatest student, what was the differentiation between the greater and the lesser? So the Gemara answers, the Talmud answers, that Rabbi Yonasan ben Uziel would study Torah, birds that would fly over his head, they would be consumed with fire. And Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, when he would study that same Torah with the same intensity, the birds that flew over his head would not consume with fire. What does that mean? Evident, if one knows no less than the other, or no more than the other, and both of them are as devout, why, when one studies the birds that fly overhead, they're consumed by fire, and the lesser student, who knows no less and is no less a servant of God, he doesn't have the same effect. The birds that fly overhead are not burned by fire. And the Jerusalem Talmud asks a question: if this was the student, Hillel, the master, the teacher, when he studied Torah, how did it manifest itself? So on that, the Jerusalem Talmud answers that Yonasan ben Uziel, when he would study Torah, it was only the birds that were within his proximity, within his 4 cubits. Hillel, when he would study Torah, even the birds that were outside of his 4 cubits, they would also be consumed by fire. That's the degree of his dimension of holiness. What is it all about? So the Ramchal, Rabbi Luzzatto, explains that each person has a different dimension of soul. Even among Jewish souls, as we said, that the makeup of the Jewish soul is different than the non-Jewish soul. But even within the Jewish soul, there are various dimensions of spirituality that are contained within that soul. So therefore, even doing the same action, 2 people put that dollar in the charity box with the same intent. But since one is emanating from a mega person, because he has a mega spirituality, and the other one doesn't have that same mega spirituality, what it activates or what it affects, it's a different reality of affecting. So Rabbi Yonasan ben Uziel, because he had another dimension of soul, as a result of that, although knowledge-wise and dedication-wise, he was no more dedicated than Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, but because his spiritual makeup was another dimension, therefore the effect of that was another effect. I'll give you an example. You have 2 people very fit, and they're shot put throwers. And they take that disc and they turn around and spin around and they let it go. The one who has greater strength, that disc is going to fly a lot further. The one who has lesser strength doesn't fly as far. Although each one is intensely dedicated and wants it to go as far, but you can't throw it beyond your capacity. Because one has a greater capacity than the other, the shot put flies a lot further. identically. The dimension of Rabbi Yonasan ben Uzziel's soul was at another level of dimension. Therefore, the effect, the energies which he generated were different dimension energies, because the spiritual energies are only in response to the dimension of the spirituality of one's soul. There's a law that a king who sins inadvertently, he has to bring a sin offering, and an ordinary Jew sins inadvertently has to bring a sin offering. However, the sin offering of the king, there's another protocol. If you understand the structure of the temple, there was a courtyard. There was an altar in a courtyard, no roof on top of it. And then there was an inner area, which was called the inner sanctuary. It had a roof on top of it. And then you went further in, and that's where you had an altar. It was called the altar, the incense. It was made of gold. Then you had a curtain, and beyond the curtain was the Holy of Holies, which only the high priest was permitted to go on Yom Kippur. When an ordinary person, ordinary means anybody less than the king or the high priest, if they sin inadvertently, they violate the Shabbos inadvertently, they have to bring a sin offering. The blood of that offering is sprinkled on the outer altar in the outer courtyard. When the king sins inadvertently, the blood that's of his sin offering is sprinkled on the inner altar and towards the curtain, which separates between the holy and holy of holies. Questions why? I mean, the two Jews sin inadvertently, seemingly the consequence and the liability is the same liability. So the Orach Chaim HaKadosh, who's, as I've always mentioned, a semi-Kabbalistic commentator, explains it's not the same. Because the dimension of the soul of the king, that he was chosen to be the king by God, to be in that level of leadership, to lead the Jewish people, he has a different dimension of soul. His dimension of soul is greater than all the other Jews. As a result of that, when he sins, the negative consequences of his actions enter into the inner sanctums of God. Therefore, when you bring about atonement, you have to sprinkle the blood, which is the blood of atonement of the sacrifice, has to go towards the inner sanctums. The ordinary Jew who sins, because his soul is not of that level of spiritual value, the consequences of the sin are not as far-reaching. It does not go as far. Therefore, it's sufficient to sprinkle the blood on the outer altar because the effect is limited and doesn't have the far-reaching effect of the sin of the greater person. That's the difference. Now, we speak about Adam, pre-sin. When he would do the right thing, which would be mitzvah. We're talking about he's a mega human being. He's the creation of God. He's the first human being to be endowed with a soul of a level of holiness and purity, not to be fathomed. And of course, I mentioned he radiated holiness that the angels have mistaken his holiness for the radiance of God. And they started to sing his praises, believing it was God. That's how indiscernible his radiance was from God's radiance. Where did that radiance emanate from? It radiated from a soul. So such a soul, such a human being, if he should do an act which was classified as positive, what level of energy would that generate? You know, we speak about the sun. The sun, in terms of its heat, the light that it gives off, is the equivalent of, I don't know how many hydrogen bombs that go off simultaneously. And due to that, the intensity of that heat is at that level that it's able to provide warmth to the planet Earth and to illuminate planet Earth. And the level of illumination is, you know, it's interesting. Stars always give light. But during the day, we don't see the light of the stars. At night, we see the light of the stars. Why? They're illuminating no less during the day than at nighttime. The answer is because the sun, the light of the sun is so overwhelming. The sun, the light of the stars pale in the presence of the light of the sun, you don't notice it. That's how mega the sun is in terms of one of the luminaries. It's the greater of the two luminaries. The moon is only the lesser, it's only a reflection of the sun. But the sun generates its own light, but it's due to this endless amount of what it's called the fission, the energy, the explosion, the heat, which generates that light, because it's mega. Adam's soul was the mega soul. It radiated a holiness which touched upon a semblance of God's holiness, because he was created in God's image and God's form. Being in God's image and God's form, that's what it looks like. You know, you have a father and you have a son. They're very often the characteristics, the facial features, and the innate characteristics of the child only reflects the parent in many ways. Lahavdil, God is infinite. Adam was only a creation. There's no comparison to any degree, but the way it manifested itself in the physical existence in terms of radiance, its radiance was a semblance of God's radiance. But that was only due to the level of soul he had. What Adam could have affected the ramifications of his behavior in the positive. So just as we understand the ramifications of his behavior in the positive, what happens if he should fail and do the wrong thing? As the king who inadvertently sins, the effect of his transgression, although it's inadvertent, is so far reaching, it touches the inner sanctums of God. Therefore, as I said, the blood, when it's sprinkled, it's not sufficient to sprinkle on the outer altar. It has to be sprinkled in the inner sanctuary, not the Holy of Holies. Adam, when he ate of the tree of knowledge, he putrefied existence to such a degree that we can't imagine, because we have no idea what existence was pre-sin. This was the consequence and the negative, catastrophic result of Adam eating of that tree of knowledge. What he did. You know, a human being versus an animal. It could be a racehorse, a prize racehorse. It can be worth all the money in the world. You kill the racehorse, you kill an animal. You kill a human being. Well, you know, the human being, if he'd be sold as a slave, he'd be a fraction of that racehorse. It's irrelevant. What man's evaluation of anything doesn't mean anything. Because, you know, unfortunately, the human race is what we call bottom line. You know, if you have a hospital bed or you have gross national product and the elderly person doesn't contribute to that, you say, you know something? It's like extra baggage. We got to unload this baggage. So who do you give the hospital bed to? We don't want old people. We want to get them out as quickly as possible, even if we have to pull the plug on them. And that's called euthanasia. We're doing a service because the person doesn't anyway contribute to society, and the person's not even a shadow of what he used to be. So what's his value? But that's the way God evaluates people. The human being, he could be 190 years old, barely functional. He has a spiritual component. He's the image of God. Every moment he exists has infinite value. We don't play God, want to end life and want not to end life. We sustain life as long as we're able to sustain that life. And we're not permitted to end it. It's only because people see that older person as an intellectual animal and it puts the dollar value on him. What's his contribution? What's the cost factor? What is the burden that he's putting on society? No, we only have to raise taxes because today we have all these people, you know, these millennials. They're so, you know, they cost society a fortune. That's what it's about. They're human beings. And they have rights no less than a younger person who has a human being, as much as he contributes. Because he is a human being. He is in the image of God, and he has an endowment. He has the same spiritual endowment as a newborn child, no less. Well, but you realize newborn child has a whole life in front of him. This man is holding at the very end. It doesn't make a difference. Until God is ready to take that person, he has a right to exist. And you have no right to terminate that existence before. But again, what was Adam's soul? What was anybody? Now, there's a story. There was a doctor up in Toronto, and this person was on life support. And the doctor felt, he was a Jewish doctor, that it's time to disconnect the life support. And he ended the person's life when he was still alive. The person that night came in a dream to that doctor and said to him, I was going to die in maybe another half an hour. But because you disconnected me half an hour before I was meant to die, I have to come back to be reincarnated and live another life to accomplish what I was meant to accomplish in that last half an hour. You're culpable. You're responsible. I would have come to my end at that time, not to come back. I'm only coming back because of you. This is what this person had come to a dream to the doctor. Do you know how the doctor was rattled, shaken up? The doctor became a Baal Tshuva. He became a penitent. He was so shaken up because he really, that was communicated, it really resonated to him that a human being is more than just a living entity that lives or dies. It's much more than that. There's an objective, there's a mission, there's a purpose. Everybody has a purpose. And some of the purposes, you should be here that long. And when God's ready to terminate that stay, that he terminates it. And until then, if he's meant to be longer, that means he has to come back for that extra stay that he wasn't here, that he didn't stay. Because you took him out of existence before he's meant to be taken out of existence. But that's the reality. Okay. So we've established a principle that based on the dimension of a person's soul, although two people do the exact same action, because it's emanating from another dimension of holiness, the value of the action is different value. Therefore, Rabbi Yonasan ben Uziel, when he would study Torah, the energy he generated and created, the birds would burn over his head, fly over his head. Hillel, that master, the teacher, even outside of the 4 cubits. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, although he was the prince of Israel, as great as he was not Rabbi Yonasan ben Uziel. Therefore, the birds did not burn. Okay? Two human beings, a Jew and a Gentile. He could be from the devout Gentiles. He has a share in the world to come. Both of them do the exact same action. The Jew does that positive act, and the non-Jew does this part of the act. Both human beings, both devout in their own areas of devoutness. Truly, one of the 7, what we call tzadiku, chasidu masa'olam, the devout of the nations of the world, the righteous. The act of the Jew and the act of non-Jew, it's a different result. The Jew generates a level of value and energy and spirituality which a non-Jew cannot generate. Because the source that generates that is the component which identifies us as spiritual beings. Every human being has a spirituality to him. The question is, what is that component? Is it a mega component or is it a spiritual component? A Jew has a component, which is called the soul, that even the angel, the greatest angel, cannot fathom the spiritual makeup of a Jewish soul. A non-Jewish soul, the angel can fathom. The Jewish soul cannot fathom. We find that Avram, all his life he did chesed. At the time when he hosted the angels, who came to inform him that his wife is going to have a child, and one of them came to heal him, and the other one came to go to destroy Sodom. Those were the 3 angels. They came in human form. And Avram's hospitality, which was on the 3rd day after his circumcision, was outstanding. And every aspect of that hospitality is evaluated And we are beneficiaries in the future for what he had done. He had offered the shade of his tree to the angels to shade them from the sun. In the merit of that, we merited the clouds of glory, which protected us for 40 years in the desert from the elements. Because he offered his bread, we merited the manna for 40 years. Miracle food, which sustained us physically, spiritually, on every level. The living wellspring of Miriam that traveled with us for 40 years was in the merit that he offered water to the angels. What was so special about this act of kindness, selfless kindness, where until this moment, Avram was involved in hospitality, espousing monotheism, using the attribute, the characteristic of chesed with the same purpose. The objective was espousing monotheism. So why does God give this moment special value which surpasses anything that preceded it? Just one basic difference. All the hospitality preceded this moment, Avram was not a circumcised person, was not circumcised. This moment, going forward, he's circumcised. What's the difference if you are circumcised or you're not circumcised? It's the same person. Pre-circumcision, post-circumcision. Avram did the chesed, the acts of benevolence, loving kindness, selflessly dedicated with the same objective, espousal of monotheism. No human being ever walked into Avram's tent, a pagan, by the end of the night was not a convinced monotheist. But there's a difference pre-circumcision, post-circumcision. Pre-circumcision, now, God created man in his image and in his form. Adam, when he's put into the Garden of Eden, he was in God's image and form. After he ate of the tree of knowledge, he was no longer in God's image and form. As I mentioned, Adam was, the name of the Zohar, Adam was created without a foreskin. Due to the ingestion of that evil, which is the most lethal level of evil in existence, that caused the foreskin to grow on Adam's organ. This is what happened. The profile on every level was not what God created. This is something Adam created. He created this monster or this deficient, limited person due to what he ingested. He's no longer the Adam, as I mentioned. Adam comes from the word Adama, potential. The potential that you initially meant to have, what you were meant to bring about, you no longer bring that about. You know, it's known fact that baseball players, as good as they are, or a person wins the Olympics swimming, you know, Mark Spitz, gold medal Olympic swimmer, once they reach a certain age, 40 years old, they're not the same. They don't have the same stamina. They don't have the same energy. They can't compete with somebody 20 years younger than them. Can't. It's not possible. Athletes, they're not able to, because your physiology, your whole essence has changed. Adam, pre-sin, was a mega human being. He was called in the image of God. He had every level of potential. He just had to actualize that potential for eternity. Once he ate of that tree of knowledge and ingested that evil, he became compromised to a point. He was no longer recognizable as that original person. That's the way he was diminished to that degree. It's, you know, could you imagine Babe Ruth would live till 100 and look at him 100 and say, this is Babe Ruth. It looks like a shriveled old bag of bones. And this is the Babe who used to hit, you know, the home run out of the stadium. You can't believe it's the same person. Adam, after he ate of the tree of knowledge, he was not recognized to be the same person. That was the diminishment. For instance, I'll give you an example. Adam, after he ate of tree of knowledge, God comes into the Garden of Eden and they hear like rustling. And they know God is, it's the presence of God. And Adam and Eve, they hide because they're ashamed. They have shame. What are they ashamed of? They're ashamed of their nakedness. Before they knew they were naked, what were they ashamed of? You ever see, God forbid, a person has a very serious stroke, and before that he was a specimen in health. Now he walks around. He has one arm that hangs, the leg he has to drag, and the hand is deformed. It's like goes inward. The person is almost ashamed to walk on the street, and he covers that arm that just hangs and is like listless, and he's listless. What are you ashamed of? Knowing what you were before and now what you've become, you can't look yourself in the mirror because of what the stroke did to the person. What about if the person himself was a dimension of holiness, which radiated a radiance that the angels had mistaken it for God's radiance? Now all of a sudden that's all been extinguished and you've been minimized. That you look like something which is close to what the animal is all about, which before you were not on the same playing field whatsoever. Tremendous shame. I'm ashamed to look at myself. What have I become? My value is not even an infinitesimal fraction of what it was originally. It's not the same. It's a different world. Now it's by the sweat of my brow I eat bread. It's no longer being that person, that prince where everything's brought to you on a silver platter. Not longer the same. Tremendous shame, tremendous guilt. Therefore, they hid. They hid to cover their nakedness. Because what that nakedness represented was because they destroyed themselves. That there's not almost a recognition between what they became, what they were originally. But that's only to tell you and give you an understanding of what his original dimension of spiritual essence was, his holiness. And therefore, he generated mega energy. And that was the radiance of his soul. Now that energy has been pretty much extinguished. Doesn't radiate the same way any longer. Avram, before he was circumcised, it was clear he was an extension of Adam with that same level of impurity. Once God says, remove that impacts and affects and restores to a degree that original spirituality. Now when Adam does that act of hospitality, he's no longer that same person. This is the equivalent of Rabbi Yonah ben Uziel. When the birds fly over his head, the birds are consumed by fire. You have now you're closer to the image of God. In our image, in our form. So although it's the same chesed, the same act of loving kindness before and post, but it's a different reality because it's being generated by a different dimension of person. Avram became a different dimension of person. He's a new creation, as we mentioned. He became Abraham. That hey that it was added to his name was the equivalent of a new creation. God recreated a new entity. He was an ex nihilo, spiritually speaking, compared to what he was before. What he represented didn't pre-exist himself. He is so-called the new Adam. Being the new Adam, your action, although it's the same act of offering the bread and the water and the shade, but in regard to what it brings about, it's a different reality and dimension of result and consequence, which originally pre and post, they cannot be compared one to another. That's the understanding. Let's talk about a Jew. There's such a concept known as a quorum. If you have 10 Jews and they pray together, it's what we call a minyan. It's a counting. It's a quorum. A quorum of Jews are a microcosm of the whole Jewish people. Although the Jewish people may number in the millions, not mega numbers. The world, 8.5 billion people, 13, 16 million Jews. We're less than a speck on the spectrum of existence. And yet, we exist, we're recognized, And we are the center of the universe because the whole world is talking about us. We have a narrow strip of land, even after the 6-Day War. 1 inch is too much. This is something the world can't swallow. What's going on? The answer is because we have a representation in terms of our essence, who we are. We represent something which is mega. They don't understand it, but it's mega and it surpasses anything that all of them combined. They don't know what it is, but it is something. The Jew somehow touches them negatively. It makes them uneasy. It makes them insecure. So they say, we can't trust these Jews. They're underhanded. They don't play it straight. They're unethical. They're immoral. You understand? People live in glass houses should throw stones. We're talking about immorality and unethical and everything that goes along with it. Look what the world looks like. Look what they're all about. It doesn't make a difference. They don't know how to interpret it. But what is that? Because every Jew possesses that special soul, that mega entity. And if you take 10 Jews together, the sum total is greater than its parts. This is a microcosm of the Jewish people. God says, my presence dwells in your midst. Because you are the equivalent of the Jewish people. And that's what we pray, or anything which has to do with sanctity, it's always within the context of 10. Because again, nothing has changed. It's been thousands of years since the world was created. Since the sin of Adam. It's been nearly 4,000 years since Sinai. But we are, in terms of our essence, nothing has changed. We are what we are in terms of our spirituality. The Jewish people are always known as Judaism is always a religion, never a culture. And the world will not allow us to forget it. You know, it's like the anti-Semite says to the assimilated Jew, you Jew. What do you mean, me Jew? Why am I different than you? I'm an American. I was born here, naturalized citizen. I got the same America. You came from who knows where. You're not even naturalized citizen. I could run for president. You can't. But yet, you're a Jew. We can't escape that label. But we're physical beings. We have the same number of limbs and organs and whatever it is. We go to the same universities. Not the same. What's the difference? There's a difference. Of course, what the Jew is, although he's a physical being in his physicality, which is the same as the nations of the world, but the component which is the essence of every human being, that component is a different dimension of component. Even the person himself doesn't realize what he possesses. As we discussed, it's only once you nurture it through certain levels of environment, mentoring, then you start having a sense of what you possess. But until then, I'm no different than he is. So if that's the case, why are you mistreating me? Why are you discriminating against me? Well, because is not sufficient justification. They don't have to have a reason. They're the majority, and they can feel and they can do anything they want, and we have no say in the matter. And that's called overt anti-Semitism, which is now again rearing its head. But why now? Because again, the way the wind blows, God is the one who determines that. Whether he's seen in a certain light or in another light. Now we're starting to be seen differently. Discrimination, anti-Semitism, acts of whatever you want to call it. In the past, just past half a year, it surpassed anything that pre-existed it over a number of years. But again, what is the Jew? 10 Jews is a microcosm of Jewish people. One Jew is a component of that microcosm, an essential component. A 13-year-old boy who's considered competent is able to complete the 10 number to create the entity called the Jewish people. 10 committed, responsible, obligated Jews are the microcosm. To be continued. Because of the sins of the Jewish people, the Jewish kingdom was divided into two. You had the kingdom of Judah and you have the kingdom of Israel. Israel was divided into two parts. You had the kingdom of Judah was the Davidic line. The kingdom of Israel was not the Davidic line. So the first king, his name is Yerovam, the son of Nevat. He was from the tribe of Benjamin. He was not from the Davidic line. The Talmud tells us, based on verses and prophets, that his dimension of greatness in Torah scholarship, he was the greatest Torah scholar that existed at that time. That all the people were like the equivalent of grass under his feet. And yet, he did something which was so unconscionable. Now, the law is that every 8th year after the sabbatical cycle is every 7 years, it ends, the new cycle starts. After the beginning of the 8th year of the 8th sabbatical cycle, all the Jews, men, women, and children gather on the Temple Mount, and the king reads the book of Dvarim, Deuteronomy, in the presence of all the Jewish people. And he sits, when he reads the Torah, he sits in the sanctuary. The law is nobody's permitted to sit in the sanctuary. That's the location where they bring the sacrifices. The only person who's permitted to sit in the sanctuary is if you're a king from the Davidic line. And that was ordained to Moshe at Sinai. The only person who's permitted to sit in the sanctuary, you have to have that level of pedigree. The king of the Davidic line. Yerovam ben Nevat, although he's the king of Israel, he didn't have that pedigree. So what's going to happen when the 8th year of the sabbatical cycle comes? The king reads the Torah in the sanctuary, and the king who's from the Davidic side, the kingdom of Judah, he sits. He doesn't sit. He's not permitted to sit. Yerovam ben Nevat, because he doesn't have that pedigree, he's not permitted to sit. So what do you think he did? He says, if that happens, everybody sees I'm not the real thing. I'm not the genuine product. I'm not the real king. You know what I'm going to do? The Jews are not going to the temple any longer. I'm going to build a temple of idolatry. They want to go to a temple, let them go worship the golden calf. And he created a temple and put a golden calf there. And anybody who attempted to ascend to the temple itself, he had sentries on the road that either would kill them or injure them sufficiently to discourage anybody even considering going there. And he brought the Jewish people back to idolatry. And we read in Pirkei Avos, not only was he a sinner, he was choti machti sarabim. He sinned and he caused the Jewish people to sin. And therefore he has no share in the world to come. This man had such a mega soul, it's not to be believed. What his potential could have been, and he was given a challenge. The challenge was called his ego. He wasn't willing to swallow his pride. And he says, if that's the case, I will not live it down, even if the whole Jewish people have to become idolaters. So we see even a person with a mega soul, he's given choices. And when he makes those choices, if they're the wrong choices, regardless of how great that soul is, because of the dimension of what it is, it's even a greater disgrace. It's a greater affront to God. Therefore, it goes into the oblivion for that reason. But the way it works is this. You have a piece of rough. You know, Mr. Glick himself, he belonged to the sites. The Bears had sites in London. And if you were of that level of diamond dealer, you would buy a box. It was a box of rough. And a box of rough probably cost $24 million. And you had to take it every month from De Beers. You have to take it. And if De Beers valued you to a greater degree, they put better quality rough in that box. And Mr. Glick, Louis Glick Diamond Company, he had a special relationship with De Beers, and they would give him quality rough. But until you cut that rough, you know, there's an expression, a diamond in the rough. You know, men's best friend, you know, woman's best friend is the diamond, okay? It's a diamond in the rough. Every soul, even the mega soul, is a diamond in the rough. That God provides challenges to that person. And if he succeeds, that soul is developed better than the best diamond cutter could develop that piece of rough to become truly mega in every sense of its word, but otherwise is dormant. Its potential, but if the potential is never addressed, it's like that piece of earth. Virgin soil, you don't cultivate it, it's just a clump of earth. But you take that soul and you cultivate it through challenges, through Torah, through doing God's will, it starts flourishing, radiating, it becomes something which is beyond, it surpasses existence. It transcends existence. It dictates rather than being dictated to. That's what it's about. You know, it's interesting. The Medrash says, King Solomon says, I envy the dead more than the living. So what does that mean? He envies the dead more than the living. When a person is born, everybody's excited. Born child, beautiful child. So the Midrash says it's like a ship that goes out to sea. A large ship. And what do? They have celebrations, bands, speaking. Everybody's excited. The ship is going out to sea. But does anybody know if that ship's coming back? Nobody knows that the ship's coming back. When a child is born, everybody's excited. But does anybody know how this child is going to manifest itself through its life's challenges? Nobody knows. But at the end of life, when you've proven that you've invested your life properly, in responsibly, now we got a special human being. So that's what King Solomon said. I envy the dead more than the living. The dead is referring to the patriarchs. When they were first born, you didn't know where they were going. It wasn't evident. But when they met the challenges, they became these mega human beings called patriarchs, where they became the location for the divine presence. And they proved who they were. But when a person's born, do we know where he's going, how he's going to manifest itself? Is he going to be that special person, or he's going to be something not so special, or even evil? Nobody knows. Therefore, he says, I envy the living, the dead, more than the living, for that reason. So, but the endowment of the mega soul is dependent on the merit of the parents. Every soul, I'll give you an example. We find Moshe Rabbeinu was the greatest Jew ever lived. There was no Jew like Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe Rabbeinu, when it speaks, if you look at the way the Torah speaks about his pedigree, it says a man from the family of Levi went and married the daughter of Levi. That was Amram married Yocheved. This is Moshe's parents. A man of Levi went and married the daughter, the Bas Levi, the daughter of Levi. And what happened? She conceived Moshe Rabbeinu, and the whole story, the firstborn of the males had to be killed. And they had names. Later, it does identify them as Amram and Yocheved. So why initially, when it says the Levite went to take the daughter of the Levite, wanted to identify them by names initially? That's the question the Maharal of Prague asks. So Maharal of Prague answers, usually the type of soul that goes into a child has something to do with the merit of the father and the mother. Its characteristics, its qualities, it's attributed to the parents. Moshe Rabbeinu was such a mega soul, had nothing to do with Amram was and who Yocheved was. Nothing to do with them. The soul had to come into this existence. So if it has to come into existence, it has to come about through the process of what? Of conception. At the time of conception, the soul is infused into that body. Which couple is the most special couple who's worthy to be the ones to bring that soul into existence? Amram and Yocheved, they were the most special couple. But not to for a second make a mistake and consider Moshe's qualities have anything with his parents, the Torah conceals the identity of the father and mother. Because who he was is unrelated to the father and mother. That's the Maharal of Prague. Therefore, the Torah does not identify who they were. It's stated anonymously to indicate and emphasize this point that Moshe is not because of who his father was or because his mother was. But rather, he was endowed initially to be that person, who he was and who he became. But every one of us, the children we merit based on our own merit or our parents' merit, grandparents' merit, that a certain special soul comes into this line is only because of those merits. Of course, there's a location called a trove of souls. And based on the merit of people, those souls are put into these certain family lines, certain pedigrees in terms of lineage. That's how it works. To be continued.